The most unjust marriage in history. Anne of Brittany was forced to love her enemy. Picture this scene if you can bear it. A 14-year-old girl stands trembling in a medieval chapel, her white satin gown feeling more like a funeral shroud than wedding attire. The man beside her, 28 years old, represents everything she despises. His armies have just finished burning her homeland to ash, slaughtering her people and destroying everything she held sacred. Yet here she stands about to become his wife, not out of love, but because refusing means certain death. This is not some fictional tale of medieval cruelty. This is the true story of Anne of Brittany, and what happened to her defies everything. We think we know about powerless medieval women, because somehow, impossibly, this girl, who was forced into the most unjust marriage in European history, would transform her nightmare into one of the greatest political victories of the 15th century. But first, we need to understand how a princess became a prisoner and how the last independent duchy in France came to die in a wedding dress. When Anne was born on January 25, 1477, in the towering castle of Nantes, she entered a world that was already crumbling. Brittany was not just another French province. It was a sovereign duchy that had maintained its independence for nearly 1,000 years, with its own language, parliament, foreign policy, and fierce Celtic pride. The Bretons were descendants of warriors who had crossed the English Channel centuries earlier, bringing ancient traditions and an unbreakable spirit of independence. The duchy was prosperous beyond imagination. Breton merchants dominated Atlantic trade routes, their ports rivaling Venice in wealth and international connections. But this prosperity came at a price. Every French king had dreamed of incorporating Brittany into the royal domain, seeing its strategic position and wealth as irresistible prizes. Anne's birth initially disappointed her father, Duke Francis II, who desperately hoped for a male heir. When no sons followed, Francis confronted a revolutionary reality. His firstborn daughter would be the future sovereign duchess. This shaped Anne's education extraordinarily. While most 15th-century princesses received only basic instruction, Anne was prepared to govern an independent state, mastering multiple languages, mathematics, history, law, and European diplomacy. Physically small with a slight limp, Anne compensated with intellectual intensity that intimidated experienced nobles. Her character was described as resolute to the point of stubbornness, with a mind sharp as a sword and an unbreakable will. But France had other plans. The French monarchy had been systematically centralizing power, absorbing duchies and principalities that once enjoyed autonomy. When King Louis XI died in 1483, leaving the throne to 13-year-old Charles VIII, pressure on Brittany intensified dramatically under the regency of his sister, Anne de Beaujeu. Duke Francis, despite declining health, understood that survival depended on finding powerful allies. After complex diplomatic negotiations, he arranged what seemed like the perfect solution. Anne would marry Maximilian of Austria, the Holy Roman Emperor, arguably Europe's most powerful man. In December of 1390, Anne married 31-year-old Maximilian by proxy. The groom wasn't present, being occupied with military campaigns. Following medieval tradition, an Austrian ambassador represented the emperor, placing his bare leg in the bride's bed to symbolize consummation without completing it. This marriage by proxy would spark a devastating war. For France, the union of Brittany with the Habsburg Empire was a strategic nightmare, meaning encirclement by hostile forces. The French response was swift and merciless. Charles VIII launched a full-scale invasion with a modern military force, including Swiss pikemen, crossbowmen, and devastating artillery capable of reducing castle walls to rubble. The French military swept through Brittany like a plague, destroying everything with systematic efficiency. Ancient castles were battered into submission towns, burned populations scattered. The famous Breton cavalry proved obsolete against disciplined infantry and cannon fire. The final catastrophe came at Saint-Aubin-du-Cormier on July 28, 1488. The last Breton army made a desperate stand, but courage couldn't overcome gunpowder and superior numbers. French artillery destroyed Breton formations before they could engage. By evening, Breton nobility lay dead on a blood-soaked field. The news reached Nantes like a death sentence. Duke Francis, already gravely ill, suffered a complete breakdown. He died on September 9, 1488, just weeks after the military disaster, leaving Anne orphaned and ruling as Duchess at 14. In Brittany's darkest hour, the situation was beyond desperate. French forces occupied virtually all her territory. Her advisors were captured or in exile, and European allies proved unable to help. England was absorbed in internal struggles. Spain was conquering Granada, and Maximilian was entangled in Eastern European conflicts, offering only empty promises. By September 1491, the French siege of Rennes Castle had tightened for months. Anne personally organized the defense, appearing on battlements during bombardments and rationing dwindling supplies. But as winter approached, soldiers deserted, civilians fell sick from malnutrition, and the walls cracked under constant artillery fire. In this desperate context, Charles presented his shocking final proposal. Anne must renounce her marriage to Maximilian and marry him instead, the man whose ambition had caused her father's death and her country's destruction. The alternative was execution for treason and total annexation of Brittany with no cultural protections. By forcing her to marry voluntarily, even under duress, Charles could claim legitimacy for his conquest. On December 6, 1491, Anne married Charles VIII in a somber ceremony that resembled a funeral more than a celebration. Contemporary witnesses described the bride's face as pale as marble, her hands trembling as she spoke vows that felt like reading her own death sentence. The marriage contract was a masterpiece of legal duplicity, proclaiming union, while theoretically guaranteeing Brittany's autonomy, but containing a devastating clause. If Charles died without male heirs, Anne must marry his successor, ensuring Brittany could never regain independence. The contrast between her two weddings would become legendary. Where her first ceremony was marked by tears and despair, her second marriage to Louis XII, 7 years later, was a celebration of triumph. Anne deliberately wore Breton colors, surrounded herself with Breton nobles, and ensured that traditional Celtic music filled the chapel. She had transformed from victim to victor, using the very system that had enslaved her to forge her own path to power. At the hostile French court, Anne was initially seen as a rebel duchess, forced onto the throne by necessity. Courtiers whispered cruel jokes about the limping little Breton who dared sit on France's throne. But she revealed herself as a sophisticated political strategist whose intelligence far exceeded theirs. Instead of confronting her detractors directly, she methodically conquered her husband's trust, using her superior education and encyclopedic knowledge of classical literature, history, and music. Anne's cultural patronage during her second reign revolutionized European court life. She imported Italian Renaissance artists, established workshops for Breton artisans, and created a unique fusion of Celtic and French traditions that influenced fashion, architecture, and literature across Europe. Her personal library contained over 4,000 volumes in 7 languages, making it larger than many university collections. She commissioned chronicles of Breton history, ensuring that her people's stories would survive even if their independence did not. She identified and exploited Charles's interests, particularly his obsession with Italian culture and territorial ambitions. What made Anne truly dangerous to her enemies was her ability to appear completely submissive while maneuvering behind the scenes. She learned to speak in the language of male power while pursuing her own agenda with surgical precision. The transformation of a conquered princess into Europe's most influential queen didn't happen overnight. It required years of careful planning, strategic alliances, and calculated risks that could have resulted in exile or execution if discovered, and created a network of loyal supporters spanning from Breton fishermen to Italian bankers, from English merchants to Spanish diplomats. She understood that real power lay not in titles or ceremonies, but in controlling information resources and relationships. Her political genius became most evident during the Italian wars. While Louis fought costly campaigns in Milan and Naples, Anne essentially governed France, managing everything from tax collection to diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers. She modernized the royal administration, introducing accounting methods that increased government efficiency by nearly 40%. Her economic policies stabilized French finances, even as military expenses threatened to bankrupt the kingdom. But perhaps most remarkably, Anne managed to preserve Breton autonomy even while serving as Queen of France. She negotiated separate trade agreements for Breton merchants, maintained an independent Breton diplomatic corps, and ensured that Breton law continued to govern local affairs. Visitors to her court often remarked that it felt more like visiting an independent nation than a French province. When Charles launched his disastrous Naples campaign in 1494, Anne organized the entire regency, consolidating her position. Diplomatic records show her transformation. In 1492, a Venetian ambassador called her the Little Breton captive, but 2 years later, another diplomat described her as the true political mind behind the French throne. Anne maintained a complex relationship with Charles, who wasn't the monster she'd expected. Though physically unattractive and intellectually limited, he showed genuine admiration for her intelligence. They shared devastating losses when their children died in infancy, creating a bond of mutual sympathy. Throughout, Anne protected Breton interests, appointing loyal officials and maintaining cultural traditions within the French court structure. On April 7, 1498, Charles VIII, then barely 27 years old, accidentally struck his head against the low lintel of a door in Amboise Castle, while heading enthusiastically to watch a jeu de paume match a medieval ancestor of modern tennis. Initially, Charles's accident seemed completely harmless. The king got up, shook himself off, joked about his clumsiness, and continued with his normal activities. However, hours later, he suddenly collapsed and died without regaining consciousness, apparently from a massive brain hemorrhage that physicians of the era could neither understand nor treat. Charles's completely unexpected death instantly and radically transformed Anne's political position. Overnight, at 21 years old, she was no longer Queen of France but remained as the legitimate sovereign Duchess of Brittany. According to the specific terms of her marriage contract, the union between France and Brittany was technically dissolved with the king's death. Anne immediately returned to Nantes openly and officially resuming her role as independent ruler of the duchy. For 9 extraordinary months, Anne governed Brittany with the complete autonomy she had always desperately desired, reversing many policies imposed during French occupation and reaffirming ancient alliance treaties with England and Spain. However, this precious window of restored independence would be painfully brief. The new King of France, Louis XII, Charles's distant cousin, was absolutely determined to maintain Brittany within the French orbit, but his approach would be radically different from his predecessor's political seduction instead of brutal military conquest. Louis XII was a complex man, physically imposing, militarily competent, and known for his genuine love of the arts, and for a political pragmatism rare for the era. More importantly for Anne, he had been unhappily married for 22 years. To Joan of France, a childless union that had been imposed on him for purely political reasons. Seeing in Anne both a personal opportunity and a strategic political necessity, Louis quickly petitioned Pope Alexander VI for annulment of his marriage to Joan, ironically using the same legal arguments that had been employed to invalidate Anne's first marriage to Maximilian of Austria. On January 8, 1499, Anne of Brittany married Louis XII, becoming the only woman in European history to be Queen of France twice consecutively with different husbands. This time the ceremony was deliberately organized to dramatically contrast with her first forced marriage. Anne appeared radiant in an elaborate dress of black and gold velvet, the traditional Breton colors proudly surrounded by her own nobility. The symbolism was absolutely clear. This was not the marriage of a defeated princess, but the voluntary alliance of two sovereigns who mutually respected each other. During her second reign as Queen of France, married to Louis XII, Anne reached the pinnacle of her political influence and personal fulfillment. Unlike her first marriage, which had been born of desperation and coercion, her union with Louis was based on mutual respect, shared interests, and genuine affection that deepened into something approaching love. Louis, 15 years her senior and vastly more experienced in statecraft, treated Anne as a true partner in governance rather than a beautiful ornament or political necessity. Together, they transformed the French court into one of Europe's most sophisticated centers of Renaissance culture. Anne used her position to patronize artists, scholars, and musicians from across the continent. She established one of the largest personal libraries in Europe, collecting manuscripts in multiple languages and commissioning new works of literature and philosophy. Her court became a magnet for intellectual talent, attracting humanist scholars who found in the Queen a patron as learned as any university chancellor. More importantly for her beloved Brittany, Anne used her unprecedented influence as queen to protect and preserve Breton identity within the expanding French state. She ensured that Breton nobles retained their traditional privileges and that the duchy's unique legal system continued to function alongside French law. She promoted Breton merchants in international trade, using royal influence to secure favorable commercial agreements that kept Breton ports prosperous and competitive, and also proved herself a master of Renaissance diplomacy, conducting independent correspondence with European rulers and maintaining Brittany's traditional relationships with England and Spain, even while serving French interests. She walked a delicate tightrope, balancing her duties as Queen of France with her determination to preserve something of Breton independence. Contemporary ambassadors marveled at her ability to appear completely loyal to French interests while quietly advancing Breton welfare. Her influence extended far beyond cultural and regional concerns. Anne played crucial roles in major European conflicts, particularly the Italian wars that dominated the early 16th century. When Louis launched his campaigns to claim French rights to the Duchy of Milan and the Kingdom of Naples, Anne managed domestic affairs with such competence that France remained stable and prosperous despite the enormous costs of foreign warfare. She reformed royal finances, modernized administrative systems, and maintained domestic peace, even as French armies fought on multiple fronts across Europe. But perhaps Anne's greatest achievement lay in transforming the very nature of royal marriage and female power in medieval Europe. By demonstrating that a woman could be both a dutiful wife and an independent political force, she created new possibilities for future generations of royal women. Her example would influence queens and princesses across Europe for centuries to come, proving that intelligence and determination could overcome even the most impossible circumstances. The tragic irony of Anne's life was that despite 2 marriages and numerous pregnancies, she never produced the male heir that could have secured Brittany's autonomous future. Her children with Louis XII included 2 daughters who survived. To adulthood, Claude and Renée. Claude would eventually inherit her mother's claim to Brittany, but as a female heir in an increasingly centralized French state, she lacked the political leverage that Anne had possessed during the uncertain years of the late 15th century. Anne died on January 9, 1514, at the age of 36, probably from kidney stones or a related illness that caused her agonizing pain for months before her death. Her final words recorded by court chroniclers were spoken in Breton, rather than French, a final assertion of the identity she had never truly abandoned, despite a lifetime of political necessity. She was buried in the Cathedral of Saint-Denis, alongside the kings and queens of France, but her heart was separately entombed in the Carmelite convent in Nantes, symbolically returning to the Breton soil she had loved above all else. The immediate aftermath of Anne's death saw the beginning of the end for meaningful Breton autonomy. Her daughter Claude married Francis I of France, effectively ensuring that Brittany would be fully incorporated into the French kingdom. By 1530, just 18 years after Anne's death, Brittany was formally united with France by the Edict of Union, ending 1,000 years of independence forever. Yet Anne's legacy extended far beyond the political fate of her duchy. She had demonstrated that women could exercise real power in a male-dominated world, that intelligence and determination could triumph over force and circumstance, and that cultural identity could survive even political subjugation. The Breton language, customs and traditions that she had worked so hard to preserve continued to flourish for centuries after her death, sustained by the example of their greatest champion. In the broader context of European history, Anne of Brittany represents something unprecedented, a medieval woman who refused to be merely a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Forced into an impossible situation by the brutal realities of late medieval politics, she transformed herself from powerless prisoner into influential queen, from conquered territory into cultural preservation, from personal tragedy into historical triumph. The story of Anne of Brittany ultimately transcends the typical narrative of medieval princesses reduced to simple pawns in masculine dynastic games. Forced initially to marry the conqueror of her homeland, she managed to transform each defeat into opportunity, each humiliation into leverage for future political negotiations. Her personal motto, non mudera, I will not change in Breton, perfectly summarizes her extraordinary determination to maintain her essential identity even while adapting to circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. The princess, who entered the chapel silently as a forced bride, emerged in history as a ruler whose influence would endure centuries after her death, proving that even in the most desperate circumstances, human determination can find extraordinary ways to prevail. Her life stands as testament to the power of intellect over force, of patience over passion, and of long-term strategy over short-term survival. In an age when women were expected to be silent and submissive, Anne of Brittany spoke, with a voice that still echoes through the corridors of history 500 years after her death.